Welcome to the Chapter 9, Section 1 podcast. And this podcast is on the chemical pathways and we're going to be talking about cellular respiration in this chapter. So let's once again, we're going to start with talking about energy. And what we know is that food acts as a source of raw materials for your cells and also as a source of energy. And we're going to really focus on the energy. So whereas in the plant cells we talked about photosynthesis occurring in chloroplasts, we're going to be talking about cellular respiration in mitochondria. And you can see here's the mitochondria, and you can see the pathway that we're following here from the cells to the mitochondria. Well, actually, from the mitochondria to the cell for its importance of getting energy. And this is what the inside of a mitochondria looks like. It's has many spaces and membranes inside, and these spaces, because they're folding membranes, maximize the amount of surface area with the membranes, which maximizes the amount of reactions that can occur. So we're talking about glucose, which we studied in photosynthesis, and we know that when we burn it in the presence of oxygen, which means when we burn it, it means a chemical reaction occurs with oxygen. It releases 3,811 calories of heat energy, and you can do things with heat energy. The calorie is a measure of energy, and it can raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So we can, and there are 3,811 calories in 1 gram of glucose. And here's some other things you can do. If you had 5 pounds of spaghetti, you could brew a pot of coffee. It's the equivalent amount of energy. If you eat a piece of cherry cheesecake, with that cheesecake, by using the energy in the cheesecake, you could light a light bulb for 1.5 hours. And Big Macs have a lot of energy. In fact, you could drive a car 88 miles on Big Macs. So there's energy in food, and that energy can be quantified in terms of calories. So you notice I corrected myself when I said burn. They don't burn the glucose. They release it from it. And the process begins with a process called glycolysis, which is right here on this chart. And this chart you should become very familiar with. It shows cellular respiration in the presence of oxygen. Now, glycolysis is pretty small. It's only going to release a small amount of energy. If you have oxygen present, then the glycolysis is going to be followed with the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain, which release even more energy, which is represented down here. This whole process, including the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, is what we call cellular respiration, which is what every cell does in order to release the energy found in food. So here's an overview of the process. We start with glucose going into the glycolysis process that releases some ATP down here, and then we have a chemical called pyruvic acid, which enters the Krebs cycle that releases more ATP, and then we also have electrons that are carried in a molecule called NADH, and that should sound familiar because we just got done with talking about electrons being carried in photosynthesis. They go into the electron transport chain, which gives us even more energy. And this all occurs in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain occur in the mitochondria. So, cellular respiration is the process that releases energy by breaking down glucose and other food molecules in the presence of oxygen. Here's the equation for it. Here's our glucose right here, and we do it in the presence of oxygen, and what we get out of it is energy, and that energy is in the form of ATP, and as a result we make carbon dioxide and water as a result. Now, this should look really familiar, doesn't it? It's basically the equation for photosynthesis, except backwards. Instead of oxygen and glucose being the products, they are the reactants. And rather than energy being released, we used energy in photosynthesis to get the oxygen and the glucose. So it's backwards. And we'll review this again later on in this chapter. So each of the 3 stages gives us some energy, captures some of that chemical energy. Remember, the chemical energy is in bonds, and we produce as a result of it ATP. The glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm, whereas the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain take place in the mitochondria. So let's talk about glycolysis, which we just said takes place in the cytoplasm. What we're going to do is break glucose in half into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, which are both 3-carbon compounds. Remember, glucose is a 6-carbon compound, so if we break it in half into 2 3-carbon compounds, all the carbons are accounted for. So the cell is going to use 2 ATP to start this reaction. And those ATP turn into ADP, and we get out of it 2 3-carbon compounds, and we gain from it 4 ATP. And in the end, we're left with 2 pyruvic acid as a result of it. So when glycolysis is complete, 4 ATP have been produced. So that gives us, and this is important, a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. There's the 2 in, and there's the 4 ATP out. So we gain 2 ATP molecules. And we also, from that, have 4 high-energy electrons passed on to electron carriers called NAD+, which makes them NADH. So now we have 2 NADH molecules, each with 2 high-energy electrons. And we know that high-energy electrons are essentially the equivalent of having energy. So we've gained 2 ATP and 2 NADH molecules as a result of this process. And the NADH molecules are going to hold those electrons until they can be transferred elsewhere and used in other reactions to gain even more electron energy. In other words, the electron transport chain is where we're going to send those. So glycolysis is fast, so the cell can produce thousands of ATP very quickly, and it does not require oxygen. The problem is we're not getting the full use of the glucose if we don't go on to the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So let's start with the worst case scenario. We don't have any oxygen present. And this could occur during exercise. Your breathing can't keep up with your needs for energy, and your body is going to go into oxygen debt, meaning it doesn't have enough oxygen to complete the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, and we're going to have fermentation. This also can occur with some organisms, which produces fermentation. And we see fermentation in the production of beer and cheeses and wine and all kinds of other things here. Here's soy sauce, which is fermentation of soybeans. And there's a couple other things I have up there. I think these are pickles, pickles here and olives there. And these all undergo fermentation. Fermentation releases energy from the food molecules, but once again, there's no oxygen. That's the important part about fermentation. There's no oxygen. It does release energy, but there's no oxygen. So, during fermentation, we talked about to go back a second, we talked about NADH having those high energy electrons. What it does is it gives them back to the pyruvic acid. This converts the NADH back to NAD+, so they're ready to accept more electrons. And then this allows us to produce more ATP. Once again, it does not require oxygen, so we call this an anaerobic process. That means without oxygen. There are 2 main types of fermentation: lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation, which you've probably heard of both. In alcoholic fermentation, we make ethyl alcohol, and this is how we make beer or wine, etc. And we create carbon dioxide as waste. When you produce beer or wine, one of the products of it is fermentation. There's some carbon dioxide left in the beer. In bread, you'll see it as these little holes inside the bread, and that all contains carbon dioxide. The equation for alcoholic fermentation after glycolysis is pyruvic acid plus the NADH yields us alcohol, CO2, and NAD+. And sometimes we can have pyruvic acid that accumulates as a result of glycolysis, and this is going to be converted to lactic acid. And I put this picture up here because this woman is rubbing her legs because she has cramps because she's been exercising so hard that she's getting cramps due to lactic acid fermentation. And this also regenerates NAD plus so that glycolysis can continue. The key to it is that you're running out of NAD plus to accept the high energy electrons. So you need to get rid of the high energy electrons, and so you're giving them to, in the case of alcoholic fermentation, you're giving it back to pyruvic acid, and in the case of lactic acid fermentation, you're also giving it back to the pyruvic acid. So the NADH molecules hold the electrons so they can be transferred to other molecules, but by doing that, and when you do this, NAD plus helps to pass the energy from glucose to other pathways in the cell. But in the case of fermentation, we want to free up the NAD plus, so we pass that NAD plus, you pass the high energy electrons onto the pyruvic acid, so we can continue doing glycolysis.